Three brothers tied to pawpaw bushes on a riverbank, shot to death by their own neighbors, without a trial, without a judge, without anyone even pretending this was anything other than an execution. That happened in America, not in some distant century of pure lawlessness. In 1882, on the border of West Virginia and Kentucky, and it wasn't even close to the worst thing that would happen before this conflict finally burned itself out. I want to tell you a number that might genuinely surprise you. Over 100 years later, worse than the Hatfields and the McCoys is still a phrase Americans use almost without thinking about it to describe any conflict that spiraled completely out of control. A workplace dispute, a divorce, a political feud between two senators who can't stand each other. That phrase has survived, unbroken, for over a century because of what actually happened along a narrow river called the Tug Fork between two families who started out as ordinary neighbors and ended up producing one of the most violent, most famous blood feuds in the entire history of the United States. Before this was over, children would be shot dead in a burning cabin, gunned down in the freezing dark of a January night while their own mother was beaten nearly to death trying to protect them. A young woman would ride alone through the night on horseback, desperate to save the life of a man who would, in the cruelest possible way, betray her trust almost immediately afterward. The governors of two separate states would come close to an actual constitutional crisis over the right to prosecute a single family, sending armed posses across state lines to kidnap wanted men rather than wait for legal extradition. And a case born entirely out of this feud would end up in front of the United States Supreme Court, permanently reshaping American law on extradition between states, a legal legacy still cited in law schools today. Born entirely out of a mountain family dispute most Americans think of as nothing more than a punchline. And here's the detail that I think should genuinely bother you, the one that undercuts everything popular culture has ever told you about this story. It didn't start over nothing. It's been turned into a punchline for over a century. Hillbillies squabbling over trivial nonsense, the kind of lazy joke that's shown up in cartoons, comic strips, and casual conversation for generations. An entire region's reputation flattened into a single dumb stereotype that most Americans never bothered to question. But the real feud grew out of Civil War, loyalties, land disputes, timber money, a doomed love affair, and a code of family honor so absolute that it demanded death as the only acceptable answer to an insult. Once you understand where it actually came from, I promise you, you'll never think of this as a punchline again. This is the story of the Hatfields and the McCoys, the blood feud that made Appalachia famous, and by the end of this series, infamous for the entire rest of the country. And I want to start you, before anything else, at the exact spot where this all truly began, more than 15 years before anyone had ever fired a shot over a pig. The Tug Fork is a modest, winding river, not much more than a large creek in most places, but it happens to form part of the natural border between West Virginia and Kentucky, cutting through some of the most rugged, isolated country in the entire Appalachian Range, hollows and ridgelines so remote that even today, some stretches feel genuinely cut off from the modern world. On the West Virginia side of that river, in the years after the Civil War, lived a large, powerful, extended family led by a man named William Anderson Hatfield, universally known throughout these mountains by a nickname that tells you almost everything you need to know about the reputation he'd built, Devil Anse, a name that, depending on who you ask, came either from his fearsome conduct in battle or simply from a hard, unyielding personal temperament that intimidated nearly everyone who ever crossed him. Devil Anse Hatfield was, in nearly every practical sense, the most powerful man in that stretch of the valley. He controlled substantial tracts of some of the most valuable hardwood timber in the entire region, at a moment when northern timber companies were just beginning to realize how much money could be made harvesting Appalachian forests and were actively seeking out local partners who controlled large tracts of uncut land. He ran a sizable whiskey operation alongside that timber business, the exact kind of dual economy we've explored extensively in earlier episodes of this channel. And he commanded genuine, absolute loyalty from an enormous extended network of relatives, hired timbermen, and allies, the kind of loyalty that could mobilize dozens of armed men on short notice if the situation ever called for it. A private force that, in practice, made him something closer to an unofficial local ruler than a mere farmer. Directly across the river, on the Kentucky side, lived the McCoy family, led by a man named Randolph McCoy, known to nearly everyone simply as Randall. The McCoys were, by comparison, considerably less wealthy and less powerful than their Hatfield neighbors, a large family working harder land with fewer resources, the kind of family that had, over the years, quietly accumulated more than its fair share of grievances against a more powerful neighbor across the water without ever quite having the leverage to do much about any of them. And I want you to hold on to that basic power imbalance as we move through this entire story, because it matters more than almost any other single fact in explaining why this feud unfolded the way it did, why the McCoys so often ended up on the losing end of formal disputes, and why eventually that pattern of loss would push them toward far more desperate, far more dangerous methods of settling the score. Now, most retellings of this story like to start with something dramatic and self-contained, a single spark that supposedly ignited the whole conflict out of nowhere. The truth is messier and honestly more interesting, because the real roots of this feud reach back over a decade before the violence most people picture, all the way back to the final chaotic weeks of the Civil War itself. This entire border region was bitterly, violently divided during the war. Families split between Union and Confederate loyalty, sometimes within the very same household, brother against brother, in a way that isn't just a tired old phrase here, but a literal, documented reality for families throughout this valley. Those wartime divisions didn't simply evaporate the moment the fighting officially ended in the spring of 1865. Devil Anse Hatfield had served briefly in the Confederate cavalry before returning home to lead a local Confederate Home Guard unit, an irregular militia tasked with policing the area against Union sympathizers and Army deserters, a role that put real coercive power directly in his hands, the authority to search homes, question neighbors, and mete out rough justice with almost no outside oversight, and gave him a reputation for ruthlessness that would follow him for the rest of his life. Randolph McCoy's own brother, a man named Asa Harmon McCoy, took the opposite side entirely, enlisting in the Union Army, a decision that made him deeply unpopular with his overwhelmingly Confederate-leaning neighbors across the river, marked in many eyes as something close to a traitor to his own community and his own kin. When Harmon McCoy finally made his way home from the war, wounded and walking on crutches, hoping simply to recover and rebuild some kind of ordinary life, he was killed under circumstances that were never fully, formally resolved in any court. Suspicion at the time, and among historians ever since, has fallen heavily on men connected to Devil Anse Hatfield's own family and his old Home Guard unit, though nothing was ever definitively proven in any legal proceeding. And here's the detail I really want you to sit with. This killing happened in January of 1865. Literally within the same month, the Civil War itself was ending, in bitter winter cold, with the entire country still absorbing the staggering scale of loss the war had inflicted. Before the country had even finished tallying its own national wounds, this single valley had already suffered one that would never actually close, a wound both families would carry quietly, watchfully, for the next 15 years. For over a decade after that killing, the tension between these two families simmered beneath the surface without erupting into sustained open violence. Neighbors still traded with each other. Families still crossed the river for church, for harvest, for the ordinary rhythms of daily mountain life. But underneath all of that ordinary neighborliness sat an unresolved killing that everyone in the valley knew about and that nobody had ever been made to formally answer for. Before we get any further into this story, I want to explain something about how disputes like this even worked in this part of the country, because it's the missing piece that makes everything else in this series make sense. This stretch of the Tug Fork Valley was, in the 1870s and 1880s, genuinely remote, hours by horseback or on foot from the nearest county courthouse, connected to the rest of the country by rough wagon trails that could become nearly impassable for weeks at a time in bad weather. In practice, this meant that formal legal authority, sheriffs, judges, courts, existed at a real physical and psychological distance from daily life in these hollows. When a dispute arose, whether over land, livestock, or a broken promise, families in this valley had learned over generations that they often had to settle it themselves, because waiting on a distant courthouse to intervene could mean waiting weeks for a resolution that might never come at all, or might come already tilted by whichever family happened to have better connections with the local officials who did exist. That reality produced an entire informal code of family honor that operated alongside, and sometimes instead of, the formal legal system, a code built around loyalty to blood relatives above almost anything else, and a genuine expectation that an insult, a theft, or a betrayal against your family was something you and your relatives were responsible for answering, not something you simply reported and waited for a stranger in a courthouse to resolve on your behalf. This is the exact cultural soil that the pig trial, the broken engagement, and everything that follows in this story actually grew out of. It's not that these families didn't respect law at all. It's that the law available to them felt, correctly in many cases, like it belonged to whichever family had more money, more connections, and more influence over who got appointed to the local bench. And Devil Anse Hatfield's family had, by a wide margin, more of all three. Then, in 1878, came an incident that has become, almost unfairly, the single most famous detail of this entire story, the one that gets repeated in every quick summary and every lazy joke about this feud, a dispute over a single pig. I need you to understand why a pig actually mattered enough to end up in front of a judge. Because on the surface, it genuinely does sound absurd. And I think that absurdity is exactly why this detail has survived a century of retellings, while so much of the real, meaningful context has been forgotten. Floyd Hatfield, a cousin of Devil Anse living on the Kentucky side of the river, was accused by Randolph McCoy of stealing one of his hogs, an animal McCoy claimed he could identify by a distinctive earmark cut into its ear, a common practical method mountain farmers used to mark ownership among free-ranging livestock that often wandered well beyond any fenced property line. In a subsistence farming economy where families survived the winter largely on what they'd raised, slaughtered, and preserved with their own hands, a hog wasn't a minor possession. It represented meat that could feed a family through the leanest, coldest months of the year, when nothing was growing and cash was scarcer than at any other point in the calendar. An accusation of hog theft in this world was a serious accusation, one that struck directly at a family's ability to survive. Not a petty squabble over property, but something closer to an accusation of attempted starvation. The dispute went to an actual formal trial in front of a local justice of the peace, an event that drew a large crowd from both families, everyone eager to see how it would resolve, gathered on benches and standing along the walls of a small country courtroom in a scene that must have felt to everyone present like far more than a simple property dispute. And here's the detail that made the outcome feel rigged before a single word of testimony had even been heard. That justice of the peace happened to be a relative of the Hatfields. The jury, split roughly along family lines, ultimately ruled in Floyd Hatfield's favor, a decision that leaned heavily on testimony from a witness named Bill Stanton, a man with mixed McCoy and Hatfield blood, whose testimony against his own McCoy relatives felt to the McCoy family like a genuine betrayal from within their own bloodline. Stanton himself would later be shot dead in an altercation with two of Randolph McCoy's nephews, years before the feud's most infamous violence had even begun. One more grievance quietly stacked onto an already growing pile that most outsiders in the valley never even noticed forming, invisible to anyone who wasn't living inside these two families' long accumulating memory. And then, into all of this simmering tension came something that should have had nothing to do with any of it at all. Love arriving, as it so often does in small, tightly bound communities, in exactly the place most likely to make everything worse. Roseanna McCoy, one of Randolph's daughters, fell for Johnse Hatfield, known to everyone as Johnse, one of Devil Anse's sons, and by most accounts a genuinely charming, reckless young man with something of an established reputation for exactly this kind of trouble, the sort of young man mothers on both sides of the river warned their daughters about, usually without success. Their relationship scandalized both families immediately, a McCoy daughter and a Hatfield son crossing the exact line both families had spent years reinforcing without ever explicitly saying so out loud. When Roseanna became pregnant outside of marriage, the situation grew even more explosive. A private scandal that both families found humiliating in front of the entire valley. The kind of gossip that would have traveled from farmhouse to farmhouse within days. Johnse was eventually arrested by McCoy relatives on old outstanding warrants, an arrest many believed was really about punishing him for the affair as much as it was about the underlying charges themselves, a convenient legal excuse to finally get their hands on a young man the family had every personal reason to resent. And then came one of the most remarkable individual moments in this entire story, the kind of detail that sounds almost too dramatic to be true and yet is thoroughly documented. Roseanna, desperate to save the life of the man she loved, rode alone through the night on horseback, across rough, unfamiliar terrain in near total darkness, to warn Devil Anse Hatfield what had happened to his son. Devil Anse responded immediately, riding out with an armed party to secure Johnse's release before the McCoys could exact any further punishment, arriving in time to free him. And after everything Roseanna had risked for him, after that desperate ride that could easily have gotten her killed or badly hurt on unfamiliar mountain trails in pitch darkness, Johnse never actually married her. He married her own cousin instead, not long afterward, a devastating, very public betrayal that left Roseanna's reputation and her heart equally ruined, effectively exiled from both families' good graces for a scandal that, by the standards of the time, fell disproportionately on her rather than on him. It left the McCoy family's resentment toward the Hatfields burning hotter than it had in years. One final, deeply personal wound added to a list of grievances that had already been growing quietly for over a decade, and this time, a wound inflicted not on a distant relative or a hired witness, but on Randolph McCoy's own daughter, humiliated in the most personal way imaginable. By the start of the 1880s, this valley was sitting on an enormous, largely invisible accumulation of tension, the kind that outsiders passing through might never have noticed at all. Two families who still nodded to each other at church, still traded goods at the same country store, still appeared on the surface like any other pair of neighboring clans in these mountains. An unsolved Civil War killing that had never been answered for. A rigged feeling hog trial that confirmed every suspicion the McCoys already held about Hatfield influence over local justice. A broken engagement and a public betrayal that struck at the heart of a father's ability to protect his own daughter's honor. None of these things taken individually was enough to explain the sustained, murderous violence that was about to follow. But taken together, layered one on top of the other across more than 15 years, quietly compounding with each new insult, they had created exactly the kind of pressure that needed only a single spark, one more incident, to finally detonate into open, sustained bloodshed that would consume this valley for the better part of a decade. I also want you to understand, before we go any further, just how far this story was about to travel beyond this one quiet valley. Within less than a decade, this feud would be front page news in New York and Chicago, discussed by readers who had never set foot within 500 miles of the Tug Fork and would never have heard of either family under any other circumstances. It would eventually draw in two state governments, a private detective hired specifically to hunt Hatfield family members across state lines, and ultimately the highest court in the entire country. What started as tension between two farming families along a remote mountain river was, within a single generation, about to become one of the defining news stories of its era and one of the most enduring pieces of folklore America has ever produced. That spark was coming, and it was going to arrive on the single most ordinary, most unremarkable kind of day imaginable: an election, a day that should have meant nothing more than voting, gossip, and a shared drink between neighbors, and instead became the day everything this valley had been quietly building toward for 15 years finally broke wide open. Coming up in part 2, I'm going to take you directly into the day this feud truly became what history remembers it as: an argument at a local election gathering that spiraled within minutes into a stabbing, a shooting, and an execution on a riverbank that would send shockwaves through these mountains for the rest of the century. Three brothers, one riverbank, and a decision by Devil Anse Hatfield that made peaceful resolution between these two families essentially impossible for the next decade. Stay with me. This story is only just beginning. It's election day, 1882, at a polling place in Pike County, Kentucky, right on the edge of the Tug Fork Valley. Elections in these mountains were as much a social occasion as a civic one. An entire community gathering in one place at one time, an excuse for trading news, settling old scores, catching up with cousins who lived a full day's ride away and were rarely seen otherwise, and almost inevitably drinking a good deal more whiskey than anyone probably should have before the day was through. Both Hatfields and McCoys were there that day, mixing together in the crowd the way they always had, neighbors first and rivals second, at least on the surface, exchanging the kind of small talk and forced civility that both families had learned to maintain in public, even as private resentment continued building underneath it. Somewhere in the middle of that crowd, an argument broke out between Ellison Hatfield, one of Devil Anse's brothers, and three of Randolph McCoy's sons, Tolbert, Farmer, and Bud. Nobody today knows exactly what started it. Some accounts point to an old unpaid debt. Others suggest it was simply the accumulated tension of 15 years finally finding an excuse to surface, helped along by whiskey and a crowd of witnesses from both families watching every word, everyone present acutely aware on some level of exactly how much old history sat behind whatever was being argued about. Whatever the spark, the argument turned violent within moments in front of dozens of people who would later give conflicting testimony about exactly what they saw, testimony that would matter enormously in the legal battles still years away. The three McCoy brothers attacked Ellison Hatfield with knives and a pistol, and by the time other men managed to pull them apart, Ellison had been stabbed nearly 24 times and shot as well, wounds severe enough that almost nobody who witnessed it expected him to survive the day, let alone the week. Blood-soaked, barely conscious, he was carried away from the polling grounds while the crowd scattered in confusion and fear, the festive atmosphere of Election Day replaced within minutes by pure panic. Word of the attack spread through the crowd and across the valley within hours, reaching Devil Anse Hatfield with the kind of speed that only genuinely urgent news travels in a tightly connected rural community, carried by riders who understood exactly how much this news was about to change everything. Devil Anse's response was immediate and absolute. He had the three McCoy brothers seized on the spot and held under armed guard, while riders were sent out to fetch the nearest available doctor for his badly wounded brother. For the next several days, Ellison Hatfield clung to life while his family waited, watching, praying, and growing more furious with every hour that passed. And while the three McCoy brothers sat in captivity, not in any formal jail, but held directly by Hatfield family members in a makeshift detention that had no legal standing whatsoever, a detail that tells you everything about how far outside the reach of ordinary law this entire situation had already moved. This was not an arrest. This was a family holding 3 young men hostage against the fate of their own wounded relative, a distinction that would matter enormously for what came next. Ellison Hatfield died of his wounds a few days later, and what Devil Anse Hatfield did next is the single moment that transformed this entire conflict from a series of accumulated grievances into an actual sustained blood feud, the moment historians point to again and again as the true beginning of everything that followed. He had the 3 McCoy brothers march down to the riverbank, tied to a stand of pawpaw bushes growing along the water's edge and executed by firing squad. No trial, no judge, no formal charge ever filed against them for anything beyond the killing everyone already knew they'd committed. Just a direct, calculated act of retaliation carried out by an armed group of Hatfield family members and associates, ending the lives of 3 young men in a matter of seconds on a riverbank. Their own families had crossed peacefully 100 times before on their way to church, to the store, to visit relatives who lived just across the water. I want you to actually picture this scene for a moment, because it's easy to let the historical distance soften something that was, in the most literal sense, a massacre. 3 brothers, likely still recovering from whatever restraint or rough handling they'd endured over the previous days, weak, frightened, tied to bushes along a riverbank in full view of whoever happened to be nearby, and shot, one after another, by men many of them had known their entire lives, neighbors who traded goods with their family, attended the same church services, watched these same 3 boys grow up on the opposite bank of the same river. This wasn't distant, impersonal violence carried out by strangers. This was as close and as personal as violence gets, carried out by people who had shared meals, shared roads, shared a lifetime of small, ordinary, neighborly interactions with the men they were now killing. Word of the execution reached Randolph McCoy almost immediately, and by every account from those who knew him, it broke something in him that never fully healed for the rest of his life. 3 sons killed in a single afternoon with no legal process, no trial, no formal accounting whatsoever. Their bodies brought home to a father who would carry this grief visibly for the remaining decades of his life. And here is where I need to be honest with you about something the legend often glosses over. Local authorities, the same distant courthouse system that had already felt tilted against the McCoys through the pig trial years earlier, made only limited, largely ineffective efforts to actually prosecute anyone for these killings. Warrants were eventually issued for Devil Anse Hatfield and several men involved in the execution, but Devil Anse Hatfield's wealth, his influence, and his willingness to keep armed men around him at all times made any serious attempt at arrest a genuinely dangerous and ultimately unsuccessful undertaking for local law enforcement, who understood that riding into Hatfield territory to serve a warrant could very easily cost them their own lives. This is the moment where the phrase blood feud stops being a figure of speech and starts being the literal, accurate description of what was happening in this valley. Because in the code both families live by, the code we talked about in part 1, a killing like this one demanded an answer, not a lawsuit, not a formal complaint, an answer measured in the same currency it had been paid in, and both families understood exactly what that meant, even if neither of them would have said it out loud in so many words. Listen, I want to be clear about something here, because it matters for understanding everything that follows. This wasn't a war with clean sides, good guys and bad guys facing off in an organized way. Over the following years, the violence between these two families settled into something historians now describe as a genuine, low-intensity guerrilla conflict, sporadic outbreaks of ambush, arson, and retaliatory killing that never fully stopped but never quite escalated into a single decisive confrontation either. A war fought in small, sudden bursts rather than pitched battles, often carried out by younger, hot-headed relatives on both sides acting on their own initiative as much as by any coordinated family strategy. Armed men from both families staged raids on each other's property under cover of darkness. Livestock was killed or driven off out of pure spite, a way of inflicting economic pain without necessarily risking a direct confrontation. Homes were shot into during the night, sometimes with families still inside, an act meant less to kill immediately and more to terrorize, to remind the other side that safety, even inside your own house, could no longer be taken for granted, that the war had come directly to their doorstep, whether they wanted it there or not. Both families began recruiting armed supporters beyond their immediate bloodline, hired men and loyal associates willing to fight on their behalf, transforming what had started as a dispute between two extended families into something closer to two small private armies facing off across a single river valley, each side building out a network of fighters bound less by blood than by cash payment and personal loyalty. Devil Anse Hatfield, with his greater wealth and his existing network of timber workers and business associates, had a natural advantage in this kind of recruitment. One more example of the fundamental power imbalance between these two families that had shaped this conflict from the very beginning and that would continue shaping it for years to come. Kentucky authorities, increasingly embarrassed by their inability to bring anyone to justice for the execution of the McCoy brothers, and under mounting political pressure as newspaper coverage of the violence began spreading beyond the immediate region into regional papers that found the whole affair irresistibly dramatic, started organizing more serious efforts to arrest Hatfield family members and associates. This is where a name enters the story that's going to become central to everything that follows in part 3. A private detective named Frank Phillips, hired specifically to track down and capture wanted Hatfield men, a task that would eventually require him to cross state lines, organize armed posses, and operate in a legal gray area that would ultimately drag the governors of two separate states into direct public conflict with each other, an escalation that neither family, and certainly neither state government, fully saw coming when it started. It's worth pausing here to describe what ordinary daily life actually looked like for families caught in the middle of this simmering conflict, because it's easy to focus only on the dramatic flashpoints and lose sight of the years of grinding tension in between. Children on both sides of the river grew up understanding, from a remarkably young age, which relatives and neighbors were safe to greet openly and which required caution, which roads were best avoided after dark, which fields sat close enough to the opposing family's land that working them alone felt genuinely risky. Church services, normally the one place in these mountains where every family gathered together regardless of any other dispute, grew tense whenever both Hatfields and McCoys happened to attend the same congregation. A careful, watchful politeness, replacing the easy neighborliness that had once defined these gatherings. Marriages between the two families, common enough in earlier generations that plenty of people in this valley carried both Hatfield and McCoy blood in their own veins, became rare and fraught, viewed with suspicion by relatives on both sides who worried, not unreasonably, about where a new spouse's true loyalty might eventually lie if the conflict escalated further. Throughout the mid-1880s, this simmering conflict continued in fits and starts, periods of uneasy, watchful quiet, punctuated by sudden violence whenever tensions flared again, whenever a chance encounter between armed men from opposing sides went wrong, or whenever one family felt the other had crossed some unspoken line that demanded a response. Farmers on both sides of the river learned to work their fields with a rifle prop nearby, to send word ahead before traveling certain roads, to raise their children with an awareness of danger that most American families of this era never had to contemplate. Neither family fully controlled every armed man loosely associated with their cause during this period, which meant the violence could flare unpredictably, driven as much by individual grudges and reckless younger relatives eager to prove themselves as by any coordinated strategy from Devil Anse or Randolph McCoy themselves, a chaotic, decentralized quality that made the conflict genuinely difficult for either patriarch to fully control, even if he'd wanted to. And through it all, Randolph McCoy's grief over his 3 executed sons never faded. If anything, it hardened into something closer to obsession, a determination that the Hatfields would eventually pay in full for what had happened on that riverbank, whatever it ultimately cost him or the family members he had left. Neighbors who knew him in these years described a man visibly changed by his loss, more withdrawn, more consumed by the singular goal of seeing justice done in whatever form that justice might eventually take than by the ordinary business of farming and raising the rest of his family. That determination and the Hatfield family's own growing sense that only overwhelming, decisive force could finally end this conflict once and for all was building towards something far worse than anything this valley had seen yet. An attack that would finally push this story out of the isolated hollows of the Tug Fork Valley and onto the front pages of newspapers across the entire country. By the mid-1880s, word of this ongoing conflict had started reaching newspaper editors well beyond the borders of Kentucky and West Virginia, small regional papers at first, picking up secondhand accounts of shootouts and arson from correspondents traveling through the area, framing the story in exactly the kind of sensational, exoticized language that would eventually calcify into the hillbilly stereotype we're going to talk about later in this series. To readers in cities hundreds of miles away, this simmering, deeply personal conflict between two specific real families started to become something closer to entertainment, a real-life adventure story unfolding in a part of the country most of those readers considered impossibly remote and impossibly strange. Meanwhile, back in the valley itself, Randolph McCoy's family had grown smaller and, in a very real sense, more exposed with each passing year of violence. Sons lost, relationships with the Hatfields poisoned beyond any hope of repair. A father whose grief had calcified into something that made peace increasingly unthinkable to him, regardless of what it might cost the family members he still had left, still living, still vulnerable, still gathered under one roof in a modest cabin that sat, as it always had, well within reach of anyone determined enough to reach it. Coming up in part 3, I'm going to take you into the single most infamous night of this entire feud, an attack on the McCoy family home itself that would leave children dead in a burning cabin, and I'm going to show you exactly how that attack triggered an extraordinary manhunt across state lines, one that would eventually pull the governors of West Virginia and Kentucky into direct conflict and send this case all the way to the United States Supreme Court, reshaping American extradition law in the process. We'll also get to know Frank Phillips properly, the private detective whose relentless, sometimes legally questionable pursuit of the Hatfield family would make him one of the most feared and most controversial men in this entire story. The riverbank executions were the spark. What happened next was the fire that finally consumed the whole valley and pulled the eyes of the entire country toward two families most Americans had never heard of before and would never forget again. By the closing weeks of 1887, the Hatfield family had grown increasingly convinced that the only way to permanently end this conflict was to eliminate Randolph McCoy's capacity to keep fighting entirely, to strike directly at the source of the ongoing legal pressure and lingering threat the McCoy patriarch still represented, even years after losing 3 sons on that riverbank. Years that had done nothing to soften his determination to see the Hatfields answer for it. What they planned wasn't another skirmish, another ambush along a lonely road, another round of livestock killed out of spite. What they planned was an attack meant to end this feud once and for all by ending the McCoy family itself, a calculated escalation from harassment to something approaching annihilation. On New Year's Day, 1888, a group of Hatfield family members and hired associates, somewhere between a dozen and 20 men by most accounts, moved through the darkness toward Randolph McCoy's cabin, arriving in the freezing early hours while the family slept, the kind of bitter cold that settles into these mountain hollows every winter and makes even ordinary nights feel dangerous, let alone a night like the one this family was about to endure. This was not a spontaneous outburst of anger. It had been planned, discussed, and organized in advance, a deliberate decision to strike at the McCoy home itself, rather than continue the scattered, unpredictable violence that had defined the previous 5 years, a strategic shift from attrition to a single, decisive blow. The attackers surrounded the cabin and opened fire directly into it, waking the family in the most violent, terrifying way imaginable. Gunfire tearing through the walls of their own home in the pitch darkness of a winter night. Bullets splintering wood and shattering whatever thin sense of safety a family's own home is supposed to provide. When gunfire alone failed to fully accomplish what the attackers had come for, they set the cabin ablaze, intending to force the family out into the open, into the freezing cold and the waiting guns, rather than let them shelter safely inside, a deliberate tactic meant to leave the family with no possible refuge at all. I need you to sit with what happened next, because it's the single most devastating moment in this entire story. Two of Randolph McCoy's children, his son Calvin and his daughter Alifair, were killed in the attack, cut down as the family scrambled desperately to escape the burning structure. Alifair reportedly shot while trying to help her mother reach safety, a detail that, if accurate, makes an already horrifying night almost unbearable to picture. His wife, Sarah, was severely beaten, struck repeatedly, some accounts say, with a rifle butt as she tried to protect her remaining children and get them clear of both the flames and the gunfire, left badly injured in the snow as the cabin burned behind her. Randolph McCoy himself survived, escaping into the freezing night along with several of his remaining family members, but he emerged from that night having lost not just two more children, but the home his family had lived in for years, burned to the ground behind him as he fled barefoot through the snow, watching everything his family had built simply disappear into flame and ash in a single night. Picture that scene for a moment, because I think it's genuinely important that you do. A father, already having lost three sons to an execution years earlier, now watching his own home burn, while two more of his children lay dead or dying in the snow around him, his wife beaten and bleeding, the rest of his family scattered and terrified in the freezing dark with nowhere safe to run. This is not distant history happening to abstract historical figures. This happened to a real family, in a real place you can still visit today. And by any honest measure, it stands as one of the most brutal, most deliberately targeted acts of domestic violence in 19th century American history. This attack, more than anything that came before it, more than the pig trial, more than the riverbank executions, more than years of scattered ambushes and burned barns, is the moment that finally shocked the wider world into paying serious attention to what had been happening in this valley. Newspapers that had previously treated the Hatfield-McCoy conflict as a colorful regional curiosity now covered the New Year's night attack with genuine horror, describing the killing of children in a burning home in language that left little room for the romanticized outlaw framing some earlier coverage had indulged in. Papers as far away as New York, Philadelphia, and Chicago ran detailed accounts within days, some accompanied by illustrated sketches of the burning cabin that circulated to readers who, until that week, had never heard either family name. Public sympathy, which had been genuinely split between the two families up to this point, some readers finding a certain rough romance in the whole affair, shifted decisively and permanently toward the McCoys after this single night, transforming Randolph McCoy almost overnight from a minor regional figure into a genuinely sympathetic national one, a grieving father the entire country now recognized by name. And this is where Frank Phillips, the private detective Kentucky authorities had already hired to pursue wanted Hatfield men, steps fully into the center of this story. Phillips was, by nearly every account from those who knew him, a relentless, physically imposing, and genuinely fearless man, exactly the kind of figure this moment in the conflict seemed to demand. A man reportedly indifferent to the legal niceties that had so far protected Hatfield family members from consequence. In the aftermath of the New Year's night attack, Phillips organized and led an aggressive campaign to track down and capture the men responsible, operating with an intensity and a willingness to bend legal boundaries that made him, within a remarkably short period of time, one of the most feared and most controversial figures on either side of the tug fork, a man Hatfield sympathizers came to view as little better than an outlaw himself, and McCoy sympathizers came to view as something close to a righteous avenger finally delivering the justice the courts had failed to provide. Listen, here's where the story takes a turn that genuinely surprises most people hearing it for the first time. Phillips didn't limit his manhunt to Kentucky soil. He led armed posses directly across the state line into West Virginia, into Hatfield territory itself, to capture wanted men, seizing several of them by force and hauling them back across the border into Kentucky custody without any formal legal extradition process whatsoever, essentially running raids into a neighboring state as though state lines simply didn't apply to him. This was, by any conventional legal standard, a serious violation of interstate law, essentially armed kidnapping carried out under color of law enforcement authority, and it provoked exactly the kind of furious response you'd expect from West Virginia's state government. West Virginia's governor formally protested these cross-border raids as illegal incursions onto West Virginia soil, violating both the sovereignty of his state and the basic legal rights of the men Phillips had seized without proper process, demanding their return and threatening real diplomatic and legal consequences if Kentucky refused. Kentucky's governor, under enormous political pressure to finally bring the perpetrators of the New Year's night attack to justice after years of failed prosecution attempts, largely stood behind Phillips's methods, arguing that the ends, finally capturing men responsible for a documented massacre that had killed children, justified whatever legal shortcuts had been necessary to achieve them, a position that resonated strongly with the public increasingly horrified by the Hatfields' escalating violence. This escalated into a genuine, serious interstate political crisis. Two state governments locked in direct conflict over jurisdiction, sovereignty, and the proper legal process for prosecuting crimes that cross state lines, correspondence between the two governors' offices growing increasingly tense as neither side showed much willingness to back down. And I think this is one of the most underappreciated details in this entire story. A family feud between two groups of mountain farmers had grown serious enough, violent enough, and high profile enough to genuinely strain the relationship between two American state governments, forcing questions about interstate law and extradition that had never been fully tested in quite this way before. Questions serious enough that they couldn't be resolved at the state level at all. The dispute grew serious enough that it eventually reached the United States Supreme Court in a case that remains, to this day, a genuine landmark in American law regarding interstate extradition and the legal boundaries of cross-border law enforcement action. The court ultimately ruled in Kentucky's favor, holding that once a defendant was actually in a state's custody, regardless of the legally questionable methods used to bring them there, that state retained the authority to prosecute them, a ruling with obvious and troubling implications about the limits or lack thereof on how far law enforcement could go in pursuit of a conviction. This ruling, born entirely out of a mountain family feud most Americans still think of as a punchline, established a genuine legal precedent that continued shaping American extradition law for generations afterward, still occasionally cited and discussed in law school courses on interstate criminal jurisdiction well over a century later, a permanent legal legacy that almost nobody studying it today realizes traces directly back to a burning cabin in the mountains of Kentucky. With that legal question finally resolved in Kentucky's favor, the men captured by Phillips' posses, along with several other Hatfield associates, eventually apprehended through more conventional means, faced trial for their roles in the New Year's night attack and the broader pattern of violence that had defined this feud for the better part of a decade. These trials, held in 1889, drew intense public and press attention, reporters from major newspapers traveling into the region specifically to cover proceedings that had, by this point, become genuine national news, filing dispatches that readers across the country followed with the kind of interest usually reserved for a major murder trial in a big city rather than a mountain feud. Most of them would have dismissed as provincial curiosity just a few years earlier. The trials produced several convictions, men sentenced to lengthy prison terms for their roles in the New Year's night attack and other violent incidents connected to the feud, and one man in particular, Ellison Mounts, known throughout the valley by the nickname Cotton Top for his strikingly pale, near-white hair, was convicted specifically for his role in the killing of the McCoy children and sentenced to death by hanging. Mounce, widely believed by historians studying the case to have been a man of limited intellectual capacity, someone other, more calculating Hatfield family members may well have used as something close to a convenient scapegoat for a crime, with far more architects than just him, was executed publicly in February of 1889 in a hanging that drew a crowd estimated into thousands, people traveling from across the region and beyond, some by train specifically for the occasion to witness what many considered the feud's ultimate formal reckoning, the single moment when the law finally, publicly extracted a life in payment for everything this valley had endured. I want to pause here on something that genuinely troubles many historians who've studied this case closely. Devil Anse Hatfield himself, the man who had ordered the original riverbank executions back in 1882 and who bore ultimate responsibility, at minimum, for the culture of violence that made an attack like New Year's night conceivable in the first place, was never successfully prosecuted for any of it. Not for the executions, not for the attack on the McCoy cabin, not for a single one of the killings carried out over the better part of a decade under his effective leadership. He remained safely on the West Virginia side of the river throughout these entire legal proceedings, protected by exactly the same jurisdictional boundaries and political complications that had made the manhunt so contentious in the first place, and by his own continued wealth, influence, and network of loyal supporters who made any serious attempt at his arrest and extradition simply too dangerous and too legally complicated to pursue successfully, watching from a safe distance as other men, some of them following his own orders, paid the price he himself never had to pay. So by the close of the 1880s, this is roughly where things stood. 3 McCoy sons executed on a riverbank, unavenged by any successful prosecution. 2 more McCoy children killed in a burning cabin, their killers largely, though not entirely, escaping formal justice. 1 man hanged, likely more scapegoat than mastermind, paying with his life for a plan that others had almost certainly designed, and the man most historians consider ultimately responsible for setting this entire cycle of retaliatory violence in motion, living out his days in comfort and safety, never once forced to formally answer for any of it in a courtroom. A genuinely uncomfortable, unresolved ending for a story that had already cost so many lives on both sides of that narrow river. Coming up in the 4th and final part of this series, I'm going to show you how this story actually ends. And I promise you, the ending is stranger and in some ways more hopeful than anything that came before it. We'll follow Devil Anse Hatfield into his final years, examine exactly how this violent, tragic family conflict transformed over the following century into one of the most beloved pieces of American folklore. And I'll take you to the actual 1976 reunion where descendants of both families finally, formally shook hands and put this feud to rest for good. The fire that consumed the McCoy cabin was the worst night of this entire story, but it was also, in its own terrible way, the beginning of the end. By the early 1890s, the worst of the direct sustained violence between the Hatfields and McCoys had largely burned itself out. The trials were finished. Cotton Top Mounce had been hanged. Several other men sat in prison serving lengthy sentences, their families left to manage farms and businesses without them for years to come. And Devil Anse Hatfield, the man at the center of nearly every major escalation in this entire conflict, remained free, wealthy, and firmly in control of his corner of the Tug Fork Valley, untouched by any of the formal justice that had finally caught up with so many of the men who carried out his family's violence on his behalf, a reality that must have felt like its own particular kind of injustice to anyone still grieving on the Kentucky side of the river. I want to tell you what happened to Devil Anse in the years that followed, because it's one of the stranger, more genuinely surprising threads in this entire story. He lived on for more than 3 decades after the feud's most violent chapter closed, continuing to run his timber and whiskey businesses, continuing to expand his family's land holdings, and continuing to be regarded, by most accounts, as a respected, if famously formidable figure throughout his home community, a man other families in the valley still approached with genuine deference well into his old age. And then, in 1911, at an age when most men of his era were well past any thought of major personal transformation, Devil Anse Hatfield was baptized in a well-publicized religious conversion, reportedly performed in the very waters of the Tug Fork itself, the same river that had witnessed so much of the bloodshed his decisions had set in motion decades earlier, a scene almost too symbolically loaded to seem real, and yet thoroughly documented by newspapers of the era who found the image simply irresistible. Whether that late life baptism represented genuine spiritual reckoning with everything he'd done, a real private confrontation with the weight of what his own choices had cost 2 entire families, or simply a shrewd, image-conscious final chapter for a man who understood exactly how his own legend was likely to be remembered by history, is something historians still genuinely debate and probably always will, since Devil Anse himself left no clear record explaining his own motives. What isn't in dispute is that Devil Anse Hatfield died peacefully of natural causes in 1921. An old man surrounded by his own large family, buried beneath an elaborate, genuinely striking life-size statue that still stands in the Hatfield family cemetery today. A monument commissioned by his own family to mark the resting place of a man they remembered as a patriarch and protector, a level of comfort, dignity, and permanence in death that Randolph McCoy's 3 executed sons and his 2 children killed in that burning cabin never had the chance to experience even a fraction of. Randolph McCoy himself lived on for years after the feud's violence subsided, but by every account, he was a profoundly changed, diminished man, carrying the weight of 5 dead children for the remainder of his life, a grief that neighbors who knew him in these later years described as never fully lifting, never really allowing him to return to anything resembling the man he'd been before 1882. He eventually moved away from the immediate area, settling elsewhere in Kentucky, seemingly unable or unwilling to keep living within sight of the riverbank and the burned foundation that had once been his family's home. In a detail that feels almost too bitterly ironic for fiction, he reportedly died years later from injuries sustained in a fire, an ending that, whatever the actual circumstances, struck many who knew his story as a strange, unwelcome echo of the flames that had once taken his own children from him, as though this valley's history simply refused to let him escape it, even at the very end of his own life. Now listen, I think it's worth pausing here to talk honestly about how this story actually got told to the rest of the country in the decades that followed, because it explains something that still shapes how millions of Americans think about an entire region today. As newspaper coverage of the feud spread nationally throughout the late 1880s, editors in cities like New York and Chicago quickly discovered that lurid sensationalized tales of backwoods violence sold an enormous number of papers, far more reliably than careful, nuanced reporting ever could. They leaned into that discovery aggressively, often exaggerating specific details, inventing dialogue that was never actually spoken, dressing up ordinary farmers in language borrowed straight from dime novel outlaws, and flattening an entire complicated region full of hardworking, deeply human people into a single crude caricature, ignorant, violent hillbillies who settled every disagreement with a shotgun and couldn't be reasoned with by civilized society. This coverage is, in very large part, where the modern hillbilly stereotype that still shows up in movies, television, and casual jokes today actually took root. Not from any accurate, careful reporting on Appalachian life as a whole, drawn from the genuine complexity of communities we've spent this entire series exploring, but from sensationalized, profit-driven coverage of one specific extraordinary feud that big city editors found endlessly, cynically profitable to exaggerate for readers who had never once set foot within 500 miles of the Tug Fork Valley and had no meaningful frame of reference beyond what those same newspapers chose to tell them week after week for the sole purpose of selling more copies. The irony here runs deep, and I think it's worth sitting with directly. The real story we've spent 4 parts uncovering together involves genuine complexity, Civil War loyalties that split families apart before either the Hatfields or the McCoys had ever exchanged a single hostile word, a legal system that was itself deeply compromised by wealth and influence long before the first shot was ever fired, land and timber economics that gave one family enormous leverage over the other, a father's unbearable grief driving him towards something close to obsession, and a code of honor that both families had inherited from generations of ancestors who'd learned the hard way that distant authority couldn't always be trusted to deliver real justice. None of that complexity survived the transition into national folklore. What survived, what got repeated at dinner tables and in classrooms and in casual conversation for well over a century, was a punchline about a stolen pig and 2 families supposedly too stubborn and too primitive to simply let go of a grudge. A version of events so simplified it barely resembles the actual documented history at all. For most of the 20th century, that flattened, caricatured version was essentially all the rest of the country knew or cared to know about this story. Popular culture leaned into it relentlessly. Comic strips, cartoons, and casual references treating the Hatfields and McCoys as shorthand for pointless rural feuding rather than the genuinely tragic, genuinely human conflict we've traced across this entire series, a conflict that, once you actually understand it, looks far less like backwoods absurdity and far more like a genuinely American tragedy of grief, power, and broken trust. But something remarkable happened as the 20th century wore on, and it's the note I genuinely want to end this series on. Descendants of both families, generations removed from the actual violence, living in a world where the original grievances had lost nearly all of their original sting, began to reconnect, first informally through shared interest in genealogy and a growing awareness of just how famous and how misunderstood their shared family history had become, and then in an event that would eventually become genuinely famous in its own right. In 1976, descendants of the Hatfields and the McCoys held a formal, widely publicized family reunion, an event covered by national media eager to witness 2 legendary enemy families sit down together, share a meal, and, as part of the occasion, sign a symbolic peace treaty formally putting the feud to rest nearly a century after it had first erupted into open violence. Cameras capturing handshakes between people whose great-grandparents had once tried to kill each other's entire families. I find something genuinely moving in that image, if you actually let yourself sit with it. Great-grandchildren and great-great-grandchildren of men who had shot each other on riverbanks, burned each other's homes, and testified against each other in courtrooms across 2 states, gathering together voluntarily, sharing food, shaking hands, choosing, quite deliberately, to let this story finally end in reconciliation rather than remain an open wound passed down indefinitely from one generation to the next, refusing to inherit a grudge that had already cost their ancestors far more than either family had ever truly recovered from. That spirit of reconciliation and shared heritage has only deepened in the decades since. Today, you can run an actual Hatfield-McCoy marathon through these same mountains, tracing routes connected to the historical feud, drawing runners from across the country who come specifically because of the name attached to the race. You can ride officially designated Hatfield-McCoy off-road trails that draw tourists and outdoor enthusiasts from across the entire country into a region that once made national headlines for entirely different reasons. An entire modern tourism economy built directly on the back of a story that once brought nothing but grief and violence to this valley. Small museums and historical markers throughout the Tug Fork Valley now tell the real, complicated story we've spent this series exploring, rather than the flattened punchline version that dominated popular memory for so long, treating this history with the same careful, respectful attention that any other significant chapter of American history deserves, staffed in some cases by descendants of the very families whose ancestors once fought and died over this exact ground. So what do we actually take away from all of this after 4 parts and well over a century of history? I think it's this. The Hatfield-McCoy feud was never really about a pig, or even at its core about 2 families who simply enjoyed violence for its own sake. Whatever the punchline version of this story has always implied, it was about isolation and what happens to trust in distant authority when that authority repeatedly proves itself unreliable, or worse, complicit with whichever side happens to have more money and more influence over who sits on the local bench. It was about Civil War wounds that a country as a whole moved past far more quickly, at least on paper, than 2 specific families along one narrow river ever could. It was about a father's grief hardening into something he could never quite set down for the rest of his natural life, and about a wealthier, more powerful family's belief that overwhelming force could simply make an inconvenient problem disappear permanently without consequence. And ultimately, it was about 2 families who spent a decade destroying each other, losing sons, daughters, homes, and any remaining trust in one another, only for their own descendants generations later to choose something neither Devil Anse Hatfield nor Randolph McCoy ever managed to choose for themselves or for each other while they were both still alive. Peace. That, I think, is the real story worth remembering here. Far more than the pig, far more than the punchline, far more than a century of cartoons and lazy jokes ever managed to capture. 2 families who fought each other with everything they had for reasons that were genuinely, tragically human, rooted in war, in love, in grief, and in a justice system that failed both of them in different ways, and whose great-grandchildren eventually found their way back to the exact same table their ancestors had once been willing to burn down, choosing connection over inheritance, and peace over a grudge that had already cost far more than either family could ever get back. Thank you for staying with me through this entire series. This has been the story of the Hatfields and the McCoys, the blood feud that made Appalachia famous.